Davy, look over there. What's that?
That? Why, that's the music machine. Music machine, like no other gadget that you ever see. Whatever you want to sing about, put something in it and the song comes out. Music machine.
In the mid-70s, the industry now called Contemporary Christian Music, or CCM, was in its formative stages. The Jesus movement was still going strong, but it was less visible than it had been during its heady days of national recognition, like when Jesus made the cover of Time magazine in 1971. Musicians from the movement, like Larry Norman, Andre Crouch, Phil Keaggy, The Second Chapter of Acts, and Love Song, had all released Christian albums, but with nothing approaching mass recognition. These things tended to sell like in the tens of thousands of copies. Future yacht rock linchpin Michael O'Mardian was doing studio work in LA. He had arranged Billy Joel's salacious song Captain Jack, and the year later released his own Christian album, White Horse. Amy Grant released her debut album in 1977, and later her fourth album, Age to Age, would become only the third gold-certified Christian album, selling 500,000 copies. Grant would change the game, but at this point, nobody even knew what the game would be. Now, oddly enough, the first two gold-certified records on Christian labels were concept albums. Bill and Gloria Gaither's Alleluia, a praise gathering for believers, was a praise cantata in the lush, inspirational Southern gospel style that was firmly rooted in the 1950s. But the second gold-certified Christian album was something new. Candle's album, The Music Machine, was the biggest album in early CCM. Released in 1977 on the newly formed Sparrow Records, it was a long-running sales phenomenon. 3 years later, when Billboard launched its first CCM chart, The Music Machine was the first album to top it. A bestseller year after year, it went gold in 1981 and eventually sold platinum and spawned legions of imitators. And yet it rarely merits mention in histories of CCM for one reason. It was a musical for children. The Music Machine was an elaborately produced, lavishly illustrated, and unshakably catchy concept album, precisely calibrated to capture children's imaginations. The plot isn't as weird as The Who's Tommy, but still, two bewildered children find themselves in Agape land, in thrall to the elaborately mustachioed conductor and his crazy contraption, the Music Machine, which spits out tunes about St. Paul's fruit of the Spirit and its unforgettable catchphrase, "Whir, whir, chicka, chicka, bump, bumps." With band, wind instruments, and sound effects lacing a panoply of folk rock styles, the Music Machine's music makes it the Sgt. Pepper of kids' records, and Mark Pendergrass's 10 pages of cartoons outclass any chick tract you've ever seen.
Joy from me, joy from you, joy is something that we do.
So, how did a children's musical outsell the first three Amy Grants? Well, it filled a gap. In the mid-70s, Disney and Sesame Street dominated the kids' record industry. But Christian children's albums were in a sorry state. So says Mark Pendergrass, who also played and sang on the record, and wrote a song about the emotional limitations of string. He says, there were people that were ventriloquists or singers that would create records and take them around to churches when they did their little vacation Bible schools and their little children's church things, and they would sell their records, and they were poor records, he says. I'm not putting anybody down. They were their best efforts. But they were nothing but, they were just nothing. We brought a professional writing team, music group, creative artists together, and created products that stood the test of time, unquote. Now, as an adult, I can think of nothing cooler than hunting down a bunch of cheap-ass private press Christian ventriloquist albums. But when I was a kid, the Music Machine's professionalism made it very attractive. I spent hours absorbing the music and Pendergrass's illustrations, the steampunk title contraption, the kid who gorges himself on cake and then sins himself into getting a toothache. But here's the thing, I was a Lutheran pastor's kid. My mom probably bought this record in a Christian bookstore because that's where we shopped for music, and that's where most of Candle's millions of albums sold. I was part of the proverbial choir being proverbially preached to. Candle was filling a market gap, but its members wanted to fill an evangelism gap. What most Christian bookstore customers didn't know was that Candle was a front organization for a radical evangelical commune called Agape Force. It was part of the Jesus movement's first wave in California. Agape Force started in 1970 with some of the typical Jesus movement stuff. They had coffee houses, a free newspaper called Rated X, a young charismatic leader named Tony Salerno, and a bunch of teens and 20-somethings sharing the gospel door to door and on college campuses. Its members lived together in gender-specific dorm-style housing, the bunk beds stacked 3 high on an estate called Coffee Grounds, formerly owned by Charles Schultz. As they ministered to other young adults, Agape Force discerned a need to teach unchurched children about Jesus, an impulse that would lead to the creation of the music machine. And we'll get into that in a minute. But first, a quick digression into commune theory. So Agape Force didn't have much money. In the early days, Jesus movement teams couldn't rely on churches for institutional support. Agape Force largely supported itself by selling Christian books as part of an evangelical sales pitch. So they would get mass quantities of cheap paperbacks like Richard Wurmbrand's Tortured for Christ, offer to discuss them with strangers, and then solicit donations. All the money went straight back into the collective pot. Jim Patton, who managed the ministry's bookstore and helped lead the music, says, "The ministry was very poor. Everybody knew there was no money, and it was all about discipleship. In the early days of Agape Force, you weren't even allowed to raise support. If you got more than $5 a week, you had to turn it into the ministry, and they would dole it out to you. You were only allowed to have $5 a week support because you were supposed to trust God for all your needs," unquote. The commune lived outside of mainstream American culture, even outside of mainstream American church culture. They were totally focused on obedience to God and sharing the gospel with strangers. Now, since the early days of the early church, Christians have fretted over how to be loyal to Jesus while living in societies that run antithetical to Jesus' teachings. And I'm using here a framework proposed by the theologian H. Richard Niebuhr in his 1951 book, Christ and Culture. Niebuhr sets out 5 different Christ-culture relationships. There are 2 extremes, bookending 3 more temperate approaches. Early in its ministry, Agape Force, like many Jesus movement ministries, was aiming for the Christ against culture extreme, epitomized by late Tolstoy, the Mennonites, and Rod Dreher's recent book, The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. Now, they might not have used the phrase Christ against culture, but their goal was total devotion at the expense of societal norms. It was a black or white vision of loyalty to Christ. Dee Patton, who helped lead the group's music with her husband Jim, thinks of this distinction in terms of light switches. Most Christians are like dimmer switches, she says, turning their obedience to Jesus up to whatever brightness level they want, playing around and pretending that it doesn't really matter and God doesn't really care, she explained to me. Dee likens her preferred mode to what she calls a digital switch, which offers only 2 options. She says, God turns up the light, and you obey, or you don't obey. Agape Force's goal at the beginning was total obedience. The Christ against culture model is hard for anyone to maintain, and most of the young people of the Jesus movement were converted hippies who loved rock music, so it was a lost cause basically from the start. In his book, God's Forever Family, historian Larry Eskridge identifies the movement's thriving material culture as one of its defining traits. Jesus freaks were more conversant with pop culture than were previous generations of evangelicals. Besides the coffee houses and the newspapers, they had Jesus bumper stickers and t-shirts and wall art, and eventually a thriving record business, all based on aesthetics and economic models that originated in the culture at large. This aspect of the movement, its most visible legacy today, falls at the opposite extreme of Niebuhr's framework. It's the accommodationist Christ of culture model. And trying to reconcile these 2 extremes has led to numerous arguments, to put it lightly. As for Niebuhr's models between the extremes, I've named some examples already. Michael O'Mardian, with his thriving music career that only occasionally reflects his faith, exemplifies the Christ and culture in paradox model, like St. Paul the tent maker. The Christ transforming culture model could be Phil Keaggy, or maybe Johann Sebastian Bach, someone who devotes their extraordinary craft to creating quality devotional art. And I'm a little skeptical of attempts to map Niebuhr directly onto CCM, since CCM is so entwined with mainstream capitalist record-selling pop music culture, right? By definition, it can't be purely oppositional. But Niebuhr's model is useful for describing the not always explicit motivations that drive people of faith, and for revealing contradictions that might, in the moment, seem inexplicable to the people involved. So I want to keep Niebuhr sort of humming in the background here. The Music Machine, along with the children's musical genre it spawned, is a case study in how easily Niebuhr's categories are transgressed, and in the destruction that can result from those transgressions. So, back to 1974. Agape Force had embarked on its annual summer tour through the US and Canada when Jim Patton finally got permission to record a kids' album. As Agape Force's bookstore manager, he'd been lobbying the ministry's leader, Tony Salerno, to let him carry C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. And he also led the Agape Force Praise Band, and this self-described kid at heart had been trying to expand into children's ministry for years to no avail because, in Salerno's mind, Jim says, Narnia and children's music were stupid kid stuff. So, touring through Minnesota, the Pattons got permission to skip the camp they were evangelizing and to make some demo recordings. Their repertoire of original kids' titles included the Rainy Day song, At the End of the Day, and they just tossed off something called Every Day is a New Day for a fair in Edmonton, Alberta. They sensed a theme emerging here. And Jim had heard Harry Nilsson's acid-inspired musical The Point, a series of songs collected by a loose storyline about people with pointy heads and the round-headed outcast in their midst. He wondered, what if they connected all these day songs with a narrative? When Jim and Dee played their demo tape for their boss, I saw his eyes light up, says Jim. Salerno finally understood the ministry potential of kids' music. So they re-recorded the demo for only $2,000 and released it with a fully illustrated book enclosed, said the cover, as Agape Force's first kids' album, Agape Land. And tracking exact numbers is impossible, but Jim claims they sold 60,000 copies of Agape Land, door-to-door, and at performances, with zero presence in retail stores. And that was before Billy Ray Hearn got his hands on it. Billy Ray Hearn was a former Baptist youth director who oversaw the Myrrh label, a new subsidiary of the long-running gospel label Word Records. Myrrh was the Jesus People imprint, completely contemporary, Hearn explained to Billboard in 1972. It speaks to the street people and to students, politicians and protesters, and it's all top 40 and middle-of-the-road material, unquote. And after Hearn listened to Agape Land, he also heard its potential and wanted in. And nobody knows how many copies of Agape Land Hearn sold through Christian bookstores, possibly hundreds of thousands, but it was popular enough that when Hearn left Myrrh in 1976 to start his own Christian label, Sparrow, he wanted to repeat the album's success. He created a subsidiary label called Birdwing to release Music Machine and Candle's other kids' musicals, well, their subsequent kids' musicals. Hearn realized that children represented an untapped, captive Christian audience, and that the Agape Land team knew how to further captivate them. The members of Agape Force had a different motivation. They wanted to reach the unchurched. While going out to evangelize adults, Dee says, Jesus people began to realize that there's a whole new generation of kids being born to people who don't know Jesus, know nothing about Jesus. There's this whole totally pagan generation that's being born to our generation, unquote. Salerno said much the same thing in a 1981 Billboard article. The Jesus movement's various ministries were forever adapting their techniques to fit the needs of their respective mission fields, and Agape Force had found a need. And judging by the number of sequels and imitators, the need was intense. Candle followed up Music Machine with Bullfrogs and Butterflies, produced by Wrecking Crew alum Mike Daisy, and featuring friend of the commune Barry Maguire on a couple songs. It would eventually go platinum also. Year after year, in the early 80s, Birdwing releases received nominations for the Best Recording for Children Grammy, sometimes along Maranatha's Kids' Praise albums, which featured an alarming blue monstrosity called Salty the Singing Songbook. With these records grew an industry of songbooks with stage directions so that local vacation Bible schools could make their leaders dress up like Salty, and church schools could stage the musicals themselves. Eventually, as the children's albums became financially successful, these different motivations, preaching to the unchurched and selling to the choir, divided the ministry into two parts. Agape Force remained the evangelistic arm, while Anthony Paul Productions, named for Salerno's first and middle names, created the records. In Mark Pendergrass's telling, there was tension between the two factions of the organization. Jim Patton explains, for the people involved in creating the albums, they became a different class of people, and they were all about writing and recording and rehearsing and all that. The general rank and file became about door-to-door and going out and selling the records door-to-door. And it became very painful and hurtful for many, many, many people. A lot of people are bitter to this day who wanted to do ministry and ended up just going to door-to-door selling records. What had started as one evangelism tactic among many became the focal point. The Music Machine and its successors basically took over what had been a street ministry, says Dee, adding, we were sad that the focus of the unchurched was lost, unquote. I asked Jim and Dee whether the success of the musicals contributed to Agape Force's eventual dissolution in the late 80s, and they agree that it did. I'm going to be vague here because I haven't talked to Agape Force's former leadership, but multiple sources and online accounts point to financial misbehavior leading to the end of the ministry. Dee ascribes the ministry's troubles to its leadership's youth and inexperience. She says, it's like a young basketball player who suddenly has everything that they always dreamed of in terms of letting that success obscure the original calling, unquote. And Jim adds, yeah, that would be a nice way of saying it. And I should add that despite these troubles, the former members of Agape Force are proud of what they accomplished. And for the most part, they look back fondly on their days in the ministry. Musicians and fans have debated the purpose of CCM almost from its birth. Most people start making Christian music out of some combination of three impulses. They want to reach unbelievers, create music for believers that glorifies God, and or satisfy their own creative urges. And they soon discover that following all three of these impulses at once is incredibly hard, and even harder to sustain over the course of a career. The music machine and its musical children showed Christian record labels that there was a large audience for what they were offering, and these records revealed inherent contradictions and conflicts that have plagued the industry ever since. Thanks.